So this is a review for From A to ZZZZ. And with me today are a couple of daydreamers. First of all, my good friend Camden Spees. Say hi.
Hello.
And the other daydreamer back for his second review is author Curtis Finley. Say hi.
Hi, glad to be here.
So we're just going through a few bits of information to get underway. So as mentioned, this is a review for From A to ZZZZ. I'm pretty sure it's 4 Z's, but anyway. Released on the 16th of October 1954. It's the 723rd in the series and it's directed by, who else? Chuck Jones. And you can find this beautiful restoration on the Looney Tunes Platinum Collection Volume 1 DVD and Blu-ray set, and I have a link below to that set. It is under copyright. You'll not find the short on YouTube unless Warner Brothers themselves choose to upload it. But in case you haven't seen it, it's about a daydreaming boy named Ralph Phillips during his time at school. It's very familiar to me, by the way, and I'll go through why in just a moment. So he daydreams certain scenarios while he's at his school classroom. So we'll go through the short anyway, but it's a pretty simple story. So we've got some trivia for this one, and this is the first appearance of Ralph Phillips, who appeared in 2 official shorts as a young daydreaming boy, voiced by Dick Beals, and then he also appeared in 2 Army recruit shorts as a young man, voiced by Dawes Butler, and they're all done by Chuck Jones. And this short, you might have seen it if you've seen The Adventure of Roadrunner pilot, that appeared as an extra in one of the Golden Collections, but that was not picked up as a series, and we'll no doubt touch upon that as we go through the review as well. Now, Curtis, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this was also nominated for an Oscar, but it lost to Toot, Whistle, Plunk, and Boom. Is that right?
That is correct,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, just nominated, it didn't win, unfortunately. But if anything, Toot, Whistle, Plunk, and Bloom, an excellent cartoon. So they're
Yes.
both worthy of the Oscar. Either one could have won.
Exactly. I do agree with that. And it's like different flavors of ice cream, they're both great, but one had to win. And well, it was Toot Whistle Plunk Boom, which if you guys haven't seen it, definitely check it out. Just be wary that there are certain stereotypes in it, which also affects this short, funnily enough.
Unfortunately, at the time, anything that involves a little boy daydreaming, they immediately go to a cowboy and Indian scenario. They could have been any genre of any medium, and it would have immediately done that. Even if it was a live action of a little boy daydreaming, it would have still gone to a cowboys and Indian scenario.
Yeah.
So I have a copy of the actual ballot that Chuck Jones had when he was voting for the Academy Awards in 1954. And on there, it has all of the 15 cartoons that were nominated, or I guess maybe the 15 cartoons that were applying for nomination.
Yeah.
He voted for Toot Whistle Plunk and Boom, Rugged Bear, the Humphrey the Bear, Donald Duck short. Of course, he voted for From A to ZZZZ, Just Ducky, a Tom and Jerry cartoon, and Christopher Crumpet from the UPA studios.
Yeah, they're all great shorts. Some better than others, but I've seen them all and they're all quite good. But I'm glad Toot Whistle won, but this one was definitely worthy of winning too.
Christopher Crumpet's not totally dissimilar to this short. It's not very similar, but it's not very unlike it. I would say it's both a little kid's imagination.
Yeah, and it has a lot of the same sort of very
Yeah.
1950s modern style that Chuck is trying to go with, of course, which UPA kind of helped usher in and define in that era.
Which is what Toot Whistle Plunk and Boom was doing too.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, exactly. It was definitely the fad at the time.
They're all sort of transitioning through to the 50s style, although it's interesting whenever you see a short that has like a 40s or even 30s design character in a 50s aesthetic. It's always a weird contrast. But this one, though, they're all 50s designed, whether it be Ralph Phillips or the teacher, the other students, and the incidental characters. And it's great. Great
Now,
fun.
it's funny that you mention that because when you look at a UPA cartoon, they are very two-dimensional, like flat. They're purposefully stylized to be a little bit abstract. And yes, Ralph is that way in this cartoon as well, especially because he's designed in 1953 or 1954 specifically for this style of cartoon. But you can still tell that Chuck and all of his animators have a fully rendered, fully animated character. Like this isn't just the same as watching Mr. Magoo on screen. Ralph
Yes.
moves around like a little person.
Chuck did even more UPA shorts later. Now Hear This is a good example of that.
And high notes.
And The Dot and the Line is a great example of that, but
It's even
that
more
was
abstract.
even more simplistic. But that was more Maurice Noble's project than Chuck Jones's project.
Excellent short that one is. And by the way, if in case anyone watching was wondering, when Ralph says at the end, "I shall return," that's a take on General Douglas MacArthur. So in case people were wondering. So it was another little bit of trivia I'll throw in.
We should mention that Dick Beals voiced Ralph Phillips. He was mainly known as the voice of Speedy Alka-Seltzer, but he also did tons of work at Hanna-Barbera, work at Warner Brothers, work in all sorts of different venues.
Dick Beals was very, very busy, I think specifically because of his medical condition. He had a
Yes.
condition that prevented him from going through puberty, so was kinda stuck. As an adult, he was stuck in a child body with a child voice. So, while it's sometimes a little bit hard to direct children in stuff like this, in voice work and in acting, not so much an adult. So Dick Beals, being an adult, could take the direction but still sounded like a little boy. So he got a lot of work doing this sort of stuff like Ralph Phillips.
And fun fact, when Dick Beals retired in 2005, his last voice credit apparently was in an episode of the Duck Dodgers TV series that was done. So nice little interesting Looney Tunes cap to his career.
I think Dick Beals did like Stan Freberg and June Foray were part of that. Almost like a threesome of three people that did a lot of different Looney Tunes stuff post Mel Blanc
Yeah,
dying.
exactly.
Yeah. And he passed away in 2012 at 85.
In terms of the other voice actors in this one, because Mel Blanc is actually not prominent in this one, according to Keith Scott's Wonderful Cartoon Voices book, Mel Blanc only does some mad laughter that's in this short, whereas you got Marion Richmond as the teacher, and you have Norman Nesbitt as the captain and the mate. So that's according to the book. So in case anyone was wondering who voices what, so there we are. So watching this short, boy oh boy, this one is so relatable. I definitely daydreamed a lot in class. And when I'm watching this, I'm thinking, yep, there'll be a lot of times where the teachers would go on about something and I would just drift away. So I would imagine that this is something that Chuck himself might have gone through in growing up, but it was definitely relatable.
Oh, Chuck Jones
Yeah.
definitely daydreamed in school. If you read Chuck's biography, there's tons of stories about how he hated school because, first of all, he was an avid reader. His dad was I'll put it bluntly, the most positive of fathers comparatively. He was an avid reader. He read way over anybody else, so he was always ahead of other kids in school. And he always was daydreaming or drawing or doing what he was supposed to be doing.
Yeah. So I'd imagine that this is something very relatable to Chuck. And I just also wanted to put things into context in regards to what schools were pretty much like earlier on. These
yeah.
days, definitely a more understanding that people learn differently. Some learn better through instructional means, some learn better through trial and error, and many other things. I'm not an expert on that, but there is definitely a broader understanding. But back then, learning was more rigid. And if you didn't conform and pay attention, despite whatever potential undiagnosed condition you might have, you were pretty much seen as a troublemaker, a dunce, an idiot.
We should also point out, by the way, the schoolhouse format of this school, which post-war would go away. I would say post-war America, but there was a time when like all kids would teach in the same basic schoolhouse. It's a trope that I imagine lasted even longer in cartoons than it did in most American cities.
I think that's part of a lot of the older directors, what their experiences were. So, Curtis, with this one for yourself, when did you first see this one? Like, do you find this one relatable, or what were your experiences with?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think everybody can relate to this. There's in many different aspects, whether you are a daydreamer, but also like the scene where, and we'll get to this a little later, when he has to go up and solve the math problem on the board. I hated doing that kind of thing. Any of this cartoon, instantly relatable. And it's timeless in that sense. That's just a part of growing up. And everybody, young and old, can relate to this from any era. Absolutely. This is a great cartoon.
For sure.
I wasn't paying attention in school.
Yeah. And thankfully, schools have evolved. They're far from perfect still, but still, they're heading the right direction, I think, anyway, at least compared to back then. I reckon we'll take a look at this short from start to finish and pepper in observations in it. I mean, first of all, we've already touched upon the 50s design aesthetic, but my goodness, I love the design of Ralph and these school children and the school itself. And it's just a gorgeous looking cartoon. Even if for whatever crazy reason you don't like this one, you still can't deny that this is a gorgeous looking cartoon.
Well, yeah, and a lot of that has to do with Maurice Noble, as always. He brings so much enthusiasm and energy to his backgrounds. Even the most simplistic backgrounds are just wonderful. And what I like about this cartoon, I think, opposed to a lot of his other more standard Looney Tunes cartoons is that he really plays with some of the angles right at the beginning when they're doing the pan, right after we get the direction credit from Chuck Jones. They do a pan to the side of the schoolhouse, and we go past all of the windows, and there are no parallel lines on any of those windows or door frames or whatever. It's all just kind of askew a little bit. The perspective is played with, and it's just wonderful. All throughout the short, you see that. And I think that has to do with kind of trying to keep the disassociation of reality through all of this. And so even if it's talking about the schoolroom, which is very real, from Ralph's perspective, he's playing with it. He's playing with the perspective. And so when he walks up to the chalkboard as well, the perspective is Ralph is tiny, tiny, tiny compared to these massive desks that he's walking through. And a great background again from Maurice Noble.
And I like the initial pan where you see all the quote unquote good students, they're reciting what they are from the school books. And then we just see Ralph, and he's just got that expression where he's clearly already daydreaming. He's imagining himself as a bird. And I like the idea. That's just a quickie thing. We just see the bird thing initially, and that sets up your whole concept straight away in the best possible way. It's quick. It's not really, I guess, haha, funny, but at least we now know what this is going to be all about. Well, Phillips daydreaming at the rest of it.
I love the little bit where he's wiggling his fingers,
Yeah.
like he turned into the bird and he flies up to the top of the frame and wiggles his fingers sticky, and he like with a knowing look at the audience is like, hey, you know what I'm doing here. And then he does a little dive down. Great animation.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Mr. Phillips, daydreaming again?
You mentioned, of course, that whole point of view of the child. I like how when you're younger, the desks always would appear so much bigger. Whereas if you go to school now, like I do as a parent, it's like, oh, gee, well, the table's always this small. They certainly weren't when I was a kid. They felt huge, just
Yep.
perspective is amazing. Absolutely amazing. I mean, it's exaggerated, but done in a way it's still believable. But yeah, you mentioned about the blackboard, doing a math problem on the blackboard. Yeah, I didn't like that either. I couldn't stand
I
it.
think stuff like that is done away with because putting people on the spot. I mean, you still do like presentations up at the front of the classroom, but they're prepared. Throwing someone up to do something like this and the possibility of being laughed at, that kind of thing, it's like that doesn't do anything for anybody's self-esteem. And we can see that it kind of affects Ralph here as well at the end of this. He's a little sheepish at the end
Yep,
when
exactly.
when people notice that he's lost in his thoughts.
And I would imagine that Jones kept this idea in the back of his mind for High Note because of this whole scene involving the numbers and all the clever ways the numbers are adapted to being characters. When Ralph is battling them, he makes, a sword out of the number 4 and all that stuff. So creative. It is really, really creative. Chuck had done similar things prior, like with Huey and Bertie about to operate on Clyde, and Clyde goes into that big hallucination scene, or in one very underrated short from 1945 where you have this dog stressing over, the number one dog, and you see all the numbers floating around everywhere. Very similar, and it's great.
And it's so much fun. It's all of the imagination that he goes through, the using the dots of the I and the J as bullets and using the J sign or the I as a gun is absolutely brilliant. And a lot of this is kind of a foreshadow to what he's going to be doing in the Phantom Toll Booth in the 70s. Because there's a
Yes.
lot of use of letters and numbers in animation in that movie, and it's really wonderful.
Ralph? Ralph! Quiet, children.
We see that whole wonderful scene on the blackboard, and once he, I suppose, comes to, the teacher's quite understanding at least. Like, I think she sort of gets it in a way. I like how, you don't think this teacher's mean or anything. It's just being a teacher. Ralph is now tasked with taking a letter to the mailbox, and now he fantasizes being a cowboy, right? Now, I just want to put this into perspective for people watching this, like why you would think cowboy, but this came out during a period of time where Westerns were huge. They were everywhere in Hollywood, on TV. So, of course, it
That's
makes
right.
complete sense why
Yeah.
you would.
The Daniel
It
Boone
seems
craze
offensive now, but at the time, every kid wanted to be a cowboy, wanted to fight Indians.
and Davy
Right.
Crockett.
I think people don't understand just how huge it really was. In fact, when Disneyland first opened, which would be about a year after this short, like I think one whole third of the park was to do with the Wild West because of how popular it was.
And these days, it's kind of frowned upon just because of the portrayal of indigenous people. And a lot of the times you can get into some pretty racist material. And then we see that in this film as well. I don't want to say not too bad. And like, is there a scale of racism? But in one of the layout drawings that I have, there's a note from Chuck Jones written on it that says, paint the Indians very, underlined twice, very red. And he says the reason this is a small boy's idea of an Indian, a redskin, that is.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that means as racist as possible. But
as red face as possible.
yeah, and while I don't think that was his intention, it was purposely to be hurtful. It was more of ignorance more than anything, and that was just commonplace at the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's Peter Pan. I mean, they literally have a song, "What Makes the Red Man Red." So, yeah, exactly. But as you pointed out, Curtis, I agree with you. This is from a boy's imagination. So, of course, what was on TV at the time and on movies, of course, a lot of things to do with Native Americans, the whole cowboys and
Yeah, and they were influencing his perception.
exactly. And that's why I'm looking at it that's while, yes, he said, make him red as possible and all that, there was nothing malicious about it. It was simply to point it out
this is
that this is what a boy.
this. We should also mention Native Americans and cowboys and Indians were huge in
Yep,
books
as well. Yep.
and of course radio. The Lone Ranger, kids' imaginations were on radio shows, serial matinees.
Yeah, they were being influenced all over the place by
Yeah.
these negative stereotypes. And so, yeah, everybody was at the time. They didn't think anything of it. And it's only now, 70 years later, that we're saying, oh man, we need to do something about this.
Yep. Yep. And rightly so. I happen to agree with that.
Yep.
A lot of this comes from, though, what a kid would play on a playground. They're going to play, Cowboys and Indians, which was a common game kids played on a playground in the 1950s.
It's a changing world, and yeah, obviously things need
Yeah,
to evolve and such. But keeping all that in mind, so I do like the way a lot of this particular bit is designed, and the added touch where again it's young boys, so we see some misspellings
On the Last Chance Saloon, there's
Pony
some
Express.
backwards letters.
Yep, Pony Express station, and with the Pony Express being this very brief thing, I believe, in the 1800s, where this is before the telegraph really became a thing, where they had to get messages from one part of the country to another. They had to get riders to ride really fast to their destination, and didn't last very long, funnily enough.
Okay, so one little note about the Pony Express background
Yep.
here. If you freeze frame on the background when Ralph Phillips is jumping onto his horse, it's just one long continuous background by Maurice Noble, and it looks proper when he's jumping off, but then as it pans, the whole background stretches to show fast movement. But if you think about it, it's like this is something that he had to draw on a big long sheet. He had to draw one house on the left that was normal, one house in the middle that was stretched as if you were like looking at a smear on an animation cell or something like that, and then another house at the very end, like the fence behind the horse, normal, not stretched. That takes a lot of pre-planning and thinking about, and it looks really cool.
And also what looks really cool, I think, is the exaggeration of all those arrows. Once these Native Americans become involved and they start shooting all the arrows, just how stylized the arrows actually are. They're not real, and they look really good. Such an exaggeration. It's like a child drawing. I like how it's like flat yellow and orange backgrounds here. I mean, clearly, you already mentioned this before, Gareth, that these fantasy sequences are a lot more stylized than they are in the quote-unquote real school classroom setting as well. And that's, of course, by design here. And it's really good. And I would imagine if they're going to show this short again, though, they would probably just cut out this entire scene.
There's no scene where Ralph and the Indians are in the same shot. So I guess you could cut out just the shots where you see their faces and you'd still get the gist, like he'd still be running for his life. There's one scene where all of the characters are on horses in silhouette and you could still show that to indicate that he's being chased. And then of course you'll see all of the arrows. So you could technically do that. These days, Looney Tunes aren't really shown in a place where kids are going to be watching them anyway. It's not like it's marketed toward children, so I would say just leave it alone. leave it untouched and let history stand on its own.
After all this scene, Ralph trudges back in like he's returning, and the teacher's reaction when she breaks the fourth wall and just goes, yeah.
About your ranch, Miss Wallace, ma'am. The money for the mortgage is gone through. Yeah.
I was surprised at that she breaks the fourth wall because I would figure that Ralph would be the only one to break the fourth wall in this one, but her little side look there is so great.
Yeah. I'd imagine that the audience watching this in a cinema or theater at the time would be laughing along just how exaggerated his imagination truly is. And she's just sort of like, yeah, I know, that kind of thing. But it's a great line delivery by Marion Richmond. So next bit.
All right. I love it. I love everything about this bit because I love that the captain of this bit. This is such a kid thing to say that says, even though I got a D in arithmetic, they think that this matters. I also love that the captain just has a belt that just says captain on it. Also, he's got the most stereotypical I'm a He-Man look to him, which basically is himself with a sailor anchor tattoo right in his chest.
You're right. It's a great scene. And of course, it's appropriate because now they're going to learn about geography. And he now dreams of an underwater situation and just the posing of Ralph as the one who'll get that Navy submarine that's in trouble, And again, the backgrounds are so stylized. It's almost like, a child drew them. It's amazing.
Yeah, a lot of great underwater effects here from the wispiness of the water and lots of bubbles and really, really good attention to make the environment seem like we are actually in the water there with Ralph.
I love the line delivery of the captain and the mate. I already mentioned before, voiced by Norman Nesbitt. He voiced Paul Bunyan in Lumberjack Rabbit and also the narrator in Goo Goo Goliath. So he did a few of these Warner shorts for a little bit. But yeah, it seems like they'll come in and do a few cartoons and then leave and never come back. So
The submarine is 700 farthings deep. Can you do it, Phillips?
Even though I got a C in arithmetic, you may depend on me, your captainship, sir.
Your deep-sea diving suit is ready, me brave lad.
We won't be able to use a suit. The flanges would never hold up at such a deep depth.
as you mentioned, Camden, I like how, he's got this anchor tattoo and the captain. He has a sash that says captain. It's just so childlike and whimsical. It's just fantastic. And he dives into the water with just a knife.
That scene with the shark, it's so funny. I love it. It just splits in half. It feels like something like Tex Avery would do or something.
Yeah, like a stick of butter, he's able to just cut that thing.
Exactly. And I would imagine that's what a lot of people think what us Aussies do just for fun. We just dive into the ocean with a knife. It's like a boy's fantasy, like he's able to lift the whole Navy sub and, of course, having a pretty nurse say, oh, thank you, as that sub goes up. It's like, is that exaggerated? Sure. But as a kid, when you imagine this sort of thing, a lot of details definitely do get exaggerated, right?
Right at the very beginning of this scene, when Ralph is still sitting at his desk with his chin in his hands, and he does that smile forms on his face and it kind of curls around, that always reminds me of the Grinch. The Grinch does his little smile, and the smile just gets bigger and bigger and weirder and more evil in the end, but Ralph doesn't go there, but it's still the same thing.
You can just feel that Jones, when he does certain things, he will also file things away for future use. Like, hey, this worked really well here. I wouldn't mind revisiting it again. And I already mentioned the whole numbers thing. He would do something similar in high notes. So Ralph is caught by an octopus, the teacher, and is put into the corner. And he imagines it being the corner of a boxing match, which is a nice little touch there. Great animation of this boxing fight, and it's timed very well with that school bells.
I think it's almost cubic in a way because look at his hands move. Look at the reaction of it the minute he punches. Look at his facial reaction. The minute he knocks his jaw right there.
Yeah, that's so evil. I love this bad guy. It's very, very typical Chuck Jones bad guy with no neck. He's all upper body, and he's a thug. He's a bruiser with a nose that looks like it's been punched a few too many times. Yeah, he uses this type of character design a lot in his cartoons.
You talked about whether or not the Indian Pony Express thing would be cut out. Now, what might really be cut out, even more than that, is Ralph Phillips smoking a pipe, because they're even more careful about smoking.
But to put that into context too, they sold a lot of toys where you could smoke, fake cigarettes, fake pipes, and all that.
This is his MacArthur line.
Yeah.
He's a parody of General MacArthur. My U.S. history is a little off being Canadian. This was a World War II general, Army general,
Yeah.
right? But he was also involved in the Korean War in the 50s.
I believe, his last thing was in the Korean War, but he would have still been fresh in everyone's minds anyways.
I think the pipe is what makes it MacArthur, because he is known for this huge pipe, like larger than
Yeah.
any pipe I've ever seen. And so in order to make that gag work, you kind of have to have that pipe there.
So we end the short there, but Curtis, have you got some other things to mention in regards to Ralph Phillips in general, or any other tidbits you can give us?
This cartoon was popular enough that it spawned a sequel, Boyhood Days, a couple years later. Interestingly, this one's a Looney Tune, and Boyhood Days is a Merry Melody. I don't know why they decided to split them up like that, but something that I discovered as I was doing some research for my book. In fact, I discovered it too late and it didn't actually make it into the book, but there was another Ralph Phillips cartoon in the works called Dreams of Glory. And it was going to be a very similar setup to these two cartoons where Ralph just has a bunch of daydreams again. It was going to take place at home and involves his parents, kind of like Boyhood Days does. So as you can see on the top corner, it says it's on MGM animation paper. So he had already kind of done his move over to MGM, and he was trying to come up with another concept. Whether or not this was going to be Ralph Phillips or a different character is going to be a very similar setup. But it was going to be Ralph Phillips because I have some of the script here, and you can see it even has a production number 1726 at the top. And Ralph is there with his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Phillips. So definitely a Ralph Phillips cartoon. Why he was doing it on MGM paper, not too sure. But I know he was moonlighting at the time, working on Gay Paris. And so he was probably using whatever paper he had around at the time. In fact, that's kind of what got him fired from Warner Brothers, was moonlighting when he had an exclusive contract.
There's the connection between Crawford and Ralph Phillips in Genesis-wise.
As we know, Ralph Phillips would go on to be in a pilot cartoon for a proposed TV show called The Adventures of the Roadrunner. And that show got shelved for a number of reasons. One was Chuck was fired, and also Warner Brothers was seriously paring down the amount of animation they were ready to kind of just do away with their studio altogether. And what was going to happen was the TV show was going to focus on a number of children, and not just Ralph Phillips and the other little boy who was there. His name was Arnold, but also a couple of other characters, a girl named Bettina, an infant child who had an extreme intellect. His name was Clifton, and also the neighbor next door, and his name was Crawford. And all of these kids were going to be regular characters in this TV show, The Adventures of the Roadrunner, which was going to always just be reruns of old cartoons with interstitials that kind of had a little through line that had to do with these little kids. He did a ton of work preparing for this, and including drawing blueprints for the whole city. He eventually named it Crawford County because he was going to repurpose that later. But when he got fired from Warner Brothers, he went on to form his own company, Tower 12, which would do animation for MGM. And there he took the concept with Ralph Phillips and all that and retooled it and was getting ready to make a whole TV show. And then this character named Crawford, who was the boy next door, would become actually the main character since Ralph Phillips was owned by Warner Brothers. The whole thing kind of got shelved because he just got busy with Tom and Jerry and doing a whole bunch of different other things for MGM. And over time, he tried actually restart that show a bunch of times. And one iteration of the show didn't work out and it evolved into the Curiosity Shop. And another iteration of the show just kind of fell by the wayside. And then finally, in 1977, he starts talking to a friend of his who is an editor for the Chicago Tribune newspaper. He kind of runs the newspaper syndicate. And then he's like, well, why don't you try doing a newspaper comic strip? And he's like, okay, yeah, I think I would. I think I would like to do that. And so he takes Crawford once again and sticks him in this newspaper comic strip. And that's the purpose of my book. I wanted to show off the newspaper comic strip. So we are able to print all of the examples of the comic strip, except for I think 3 that we couldn't find, which I've found since because online newspaper articles became much more prevalent since I wrote this book. And that comic strip only lasted for 6 months before either Chuck gave it up or got bored with it or got too busy with other stuff. No one really knows why. It only lasted for 6 months. But it all has its genesis with Ralph Phillips, which is kind of cool to see the through lines. And if you look at the comic strip, there's so much of Ralph Phillips in there. Crawford's a daydreamer. His buddy Morgan is a daydreamer, and a lot of the poses, a lot of the look of the characters are directly influenced from the stuff he was doing with Ralph. I think Ralph Phillips is kind of the start of Chuck Jones exploring the inner mind and kind of his intellectual side. And that really comes into play in his post Warner Brothers stuff. The White Seal is a lot of that. All of
Yeah.
his Jungle Book shorts are a lot of that. And that concept, I think, works better in a comic format where you can
Yes.
digest it at your own pace rather than the pace that Chuck Jones is determining in film. I think that From A to Z stands as one of the best Looney Tunes cartoons from this later era. I think it has a benefit of not having any of the Looney Tunes characters in it. And because of that, it stands out and it stands, I think, above as a really unique and fully realized concept. Everything is firing on all the right cylinders. The animation, the writing, the poses, the backgrounds. We didn't even talk about the music, which actually plays a really big role in this cartoon as well, because Ralph doesn't say very much. And
Yeah.
so a lot of his actions, a lot of his thoughts, a lot of his movements are emphasized by the musical choices that are made by Carl Stalling.
At this point in time, both him and Mill Franklin are sort of alternating, not one for one, but they're alternating, and then Starling would retire a few years after this. But yeah, you're right. Definitely the music in this one is definitely an important part as well. And all the elements just work so well together in this one. Now, admittedly, this is not a go-to short for me. It's not one that if I was to pick one at random, I'd go towards it. That's just personal taste. But that being said, this is an
Yeah.
amazing cartoon. There's no doubt about it. And very relatable, as I mentioned before. I still have to give this one 10 out of 10 because it really is one of the greatest Looney Tunes ever made.
yeah.
Just because something may not be one I would automatically pick doesn't mean I can't say, oh yeah, this is a perfect cartoon. So mind the stereotypes, of course, but otherwise, yeah, it's perfect. So 10 out of 10.
10 out of 10 for me.
Yeah.
10 out of 10
Yeah.
for sure. Yep,
So
absolutely.
definitely. But that will do it for this one. Once again, Curtis, thank you so much for coming on here. And if you want to do more reviews, you're always welcome. We can pick one that's maybe not a
Yeah.
Chuck Jones, not a Really Reaver Roadrunner short, okay? It'll be a good one, okay? It'll be something.
Well, hey, I don't mind also talking about bad ones.
So I guess pre-hysterical hair, Curtis Finley. Done. There we go. No, I kid. I kid. We'll see what happens. For now, let's finish
Yes.
1954. But that will do it for this one. Thanks so much for watching, guys. And until next time, take care.
I shall return.